Jordan's King Abdullah spilled the beans. In the upcoming issue of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg profiles the Arab leader who candidly criticizes Egypt, Turkey, and Syria. Abdullah is the most pro-American Arab leader in the Middle East, but also Jordan is home to one of the smallest and poorest Arab nations. He insists that only he can lead the transition to democracy, in part to ensure that democracy will not be delivered to his Islamist opponents. Joining us to discuss this is Nikita Malik, Middle East political analyst. Nikita, thank you for joining us. Abdullah says of President Morsi of Egypt that he has no depth. He says of Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey that he is an authoritarian who views democracy as a bus ride, a vehicle to assuming power, and says of President Bashar al-Assad of Syria that he's so provincial he had never heard of jet lag. Why is he throwing them under the bus, and what do you make of this interview?
Hi. I think it's important to examine the lens by which we view an interview like this. So, if you're seeing the article from Abdullah's perspective, he is situating these countries. I don't think he intends to be critical, but I think it's the way that his words have been depicted in this article that are making him critical.
So whether it's the way his words were depicted, which I know that a lot of people in the parliament in Jordan have actually been saying since the news of this article came out, the timing is curious, that this comes 2 weeks, or actually less, I should say, 2 or 3 days after he said that his relationship, by comparison with Prime Minister Netanyahu, has tightened. He referenced it being very strong and being very pessimistic about a two-state solution right before Obama's trip. I mean, what is the timing of this? Do you think that the timing matters? Do you think that he intended to be as critical as he was of the Arab leaders while being so complimentary of Netanyahu's relationship?
I think we need to delineate what Abdullah intended and what Jeffrey Goldberg has done. So we're looking at when this article was published, which we know is intending to be published in April, but all of this news is coming out now, and Obama will be here on Friday. And so Goldberg talks about how Abdullah calls it Isra time, but then I think it's important to note that in other parts of the article, Abdullah is very positive about both Israel and Palestine, saying that Palestine should be more proportionately represented in Jordan. And like you mentioned earlier, this has been met with a lot of criticism from the news agencies in Jordan as well, who are saying that his words were taken out of context.
And so when it comes to being out of context, I mean, he is allegedly describing the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who he's been very critical of before, as you know, and he's been critical of the Islamist movement in general. And it is worth mentioning he does have the closest relationship to the Obama administration. I mean, calling Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood a Masonic cult, wolves in sheep's clothing, do you think that that's all taken out of context? I mean, time will tell, but...
I mean, yes, I do think it's taken all out of context because Jeffrey Goldberg is the same man who wrote an article 13 years ago for the New York Times called, How to Lead, and he cited King Abdullah as the chief proponent of this region who would teach, implying that he could teach or he could lead an example to other Middle Eastern rulers in this region. And if we situate Abdullah as a moderate, which Abdullah is doing himself by saying that these are wolves in sheep's clothing, he is positioning himself as a moderate who is going to lead reform towards a constitutional monarchy, and he's implying that the opposition groups would not be able to do so.
And so I appreciate you making these distinctions. I think this is why we should be talking about this, and obviously we need to wait for the full interview and series of interviews to come out in the report. But if this quote that is circulating is true, I want to ask you about it. Apparently, he told Jeffrey Goldberg, when you go to the State Department and talk about this, being critical of the Muslim Brotherhood, this is just the liberals talking, is what the State Department says. This is the Monarch saying that the Muslim Brotherhood is deep-rooted and sinister. I mean, this can't all be out of context, unless Jeffrey Goldberg is flat-out lying, which I can't imagine he is.
No, I don't think he is lying. I think it's about the role of the media in positioning certain views over others. So I would like at this moment to point out that the Western media is positioning this in in a certain light, and the Arab media has not. So if you look at, today's New York Times heading is Jordan's King finds fault in everyone, and the heading for the BBC is King Abdullah criticizes regional leaders. But the heading of the Petra News today is that Jordan's king. I've written this down. Jordan's King Abdullah's comments have been taken out of context. That he seeks to champion reforms. So in terms of what you're saying, that no, not everything is out of context, but it might be certain posts are being used to further certain things that he may not have meant.
Well, yeah, I think it's interesting that you bring that up because, of course, he went after Prime Minister Erdogan, according to Jeffrey Goldberg's reports, and you're right to point out that largely this is where the conversation has been dominated, is in the Western media. But if we look at, Hurriyet Daily News, which is out of Turkey, the leading source...
Sorry, that might be because, and I've made that statement, but that might be because the Arab newspapers have not translated it yet, and they have not caught on to it yet. So, again, it is important to stress that what kind of reaction will we get tomorrow or day after tomorrow once this has been translated.
No, I agree with you, and that's an important note. Last thing I want to bring up, though, is Turkish diplomats in Amman have been looking for explanations now that this news has come out, and according to Jordanian officials, they're denying the remarks, and they're saying that they will offer a public and general explanation. I mean, what do you anticipate, not just about these remarks, but about the king's positioning there in Jordan? A lot of people would say that some of his criticisms about these leaders being authoritative and trying to dispel this notion that he claims exists in the Western media, that the only way democracy can flourish in the region would be at the hands of Islamists, and that he wants to kind of fight against that, and that only he insisted, I believe, and I just want to make sure I get this writing, or rather his words correct, he insisted that only he could lead Jordan to a place where democracy exists, or it's more like a constitutional monarchy, let's say, like Britain. I mean, that in of itself is pretty authoritative.
I think what we're looking at here is what Curtis Ryan has deemed you cannot have revolution without evolution. So I think what Abdullah is trying to say here is that you have the situations in Egypt, Tunisia, where reform happened very quickly because of revolution, and yet there has been no organic growth. So what Abdullah is, I think what he's trying to do, if we take away the angling of this, is saying that the reforms are happening, but they're probably not happening at a pace that everybody likes. So he's trying to initiate these reforms, but they're not fast enough for the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamic Action Front or opposition groups. So, and a chief example of that would be the election reforms that have happened recently. So he's trying to say that he's initiating it, and people should be patient, I suppose.
And perhaps one thing we haven't mentioned, an elephant, so to speak, in the room is the notion that Jordan is really struggling to keep up with the influx of refugees coming from Syria. Obviously, we've seen the circumstances in the refugee camps being worse than they have been. And of course, just 10 years ago when Iraqi refugees started coming, it really seems like Jordan is reaching its limits. I mean, what kind of pressures do you think King Abdullah is under, or what major pressure is he under?
In Jeffrey Goldberg's article, Abdullah says that we will not turn these refugees away, and he's absolutely right. Jordan has been very accommodating in that sense. But then, you have to keep in mind that Abdullah's interests are also with the Jordanian people and providing for them, and not at the expense of providing for refugees. So that's a very interesting dynamic that. And it's also interesting to note that with the problems that are happening in Syria, the influx of refugees is going to be much more long-term than we think. So it's not like there's going to be a massive influx of refugees today. This is going to happen over 5 or 10 years, and this country needs to have the proper infrastructure to be able to accommodate more people.
So certainly a salient point and a pattern, really, whether it's Palestinian refugees who make up so much of Jordan's population, Iraqi refugees, now Syria refugees, Jordan certainly proving to be under perhaps the most stress when it comes to that unfolding situation. Thank you so much, Nikita, for joining us.
No problem.
Up next, remember the Iraq war contractors? They're back.